bees. I mean, as far as we're concerned, that's the most pressing issue, but in the wider issue, it's the entire ecology we're talking about. So it may seem odd that we've got slides about birds in, but that's why they're there, because it was to influence the Sierra Club. And it was, by the way, a great meeting. We really opened some minds, I think. Okay, so this is the introductory slide, and it's one of my bees, a worker bee returning to the hive with full pollen baskets full of oilseed rape pollen, or you call canola, and that pollen is poison because I live in the centre of a canola growing area, and I'm surrounded by farmers who use imidacloprid mainly on the oilseed rape. And as you know, I've had most of my hives die since 2006. I haven't made a single jar of honey, although I'm only a hobby beekeeper. So this is about neonicotinoid insecticides and their impact on bees, insects, birds and the wider ecology. As you're familiar with, bees pollinate about 30% of all of our food crops, and generally the crops that we most enjoy, fruits and vegetables. That's common knowledge. But Tom Theobald asked me to stress that most of our wildflowers, particularly in the mountain zones, are pollinated by bumblebees because it's too cold at altitude for wild honeybees to do the pollination. So bumblebees are very, very important in this discussion and this debate. So this is just some apples, apple blossom in my own backyard. I have a small number of apple trees.
Next slide.
And some of them were, next slide. And next slide again, here is a barrel of apples that I harvested several years ago. And we haven't had much of a harvest since because of the lack of bumblebees in particular. As everybody who deals with bees knows, without bees there would be no plums, no pears, no apples, no squash, no tomatoes, no peppers, no berries. And these are only the human dimensions. There would also be no berries and nuts for wildlife. So whether we're talking about squirrels or mice or raccoons or deer, their existence is equally crucially dependent on wild pollinators. And this is my hometown local market in Scotland, and as you can see, there's a whole variety of fruits and vegetables there, and without pollinators they simply will not be there. And one of our great fears is that the corporations who are involved in all this are working on strategies to produce fruits that don't need bees by genetic manipulation. So we are living in the 21st year of a global pandemic of bee deaths that began, a global pandemic of bee deaths that began in France around 1994. And these are my own amateur estimates, but conservatively at least 10 million colonies of bees have died in America since 2003. And if we were to include the bees that died from imidacloprid between 1992 and 2003, I suspect you could possibly add another 5 million or more to that figure. Argentina suffered a massive loss of bees in 2008, and I believe that before that Argentina was the #1 producer of honey in the world, and that the honey crop crashed by 50% with the introduction of soybeans on a massive scale treated with neonics, and they've never recovered their position in the honey tables. France is crucially important because it's where the resistance to the pesticide corporations first began. They lost 1 million hives in 1994 in a single year, and they knew instantly what the cause was. They didn't need laboratory work, they didn't need advisory people from the colleges. They just said, we put the bees in the sunflowers and the hives collapsed within weeks. Whereas bees from the same bee yards that we put into the forest for chestnut honey are absolutely fine. And the bees had the same burden of varroa, the same burden of viruses, the same burden of bacteria, but one part of the bees. The ones that went into the arable crops died, and the ones that went into the natural areas were absolutely fine. And that pattern was repeated all over France. So the French were the first people to fight back, and they successfully achieved the banning of neonics in 2000, and that ban has never been rescinded.
And how are their bees doing?
The French bees are doing absolutely fine. It's similar to America. It's in that it is a proper industry. Many thousands of people make their living by being migratory beekeepers in France, which doesn't happen in Britain at all, but it's a French thing, like America. Germany is famous, of course, because that's the first time that there was a massive bee kill, 10,000 hives in a matter of 2 or 3 days in the Rhineland. And that was as a result of planter exhaust dust from crops using clothianidin. And again, it was vitally important because the Germans analysed the dead bees immediately within a week, and they agreed to pay massive reparations to all the bee farmers who'd lost their bees. And clothianidin was banned subsequently in Germany at that time, and again the ban has never been rescinded. In the UK, we don't really know how many bees we've lost because unfortunately our beekeeping organisation, the BBKA, is completely in the hands of the pesticide lobby and the government lobby, so we just get fudge after fudge, but we know that we're losing around 50% of bees annually. Certainly my bees are more than that. Italy again is a famous case because they lost 10,000 colonies in a single matter of a month, because clothianidin was used on corn in the Po Valley. And again, the Italians took very swift political action, and they banned the use of clothianidin and imidacloprid on corn, and the bees came back within a year. They were back to normal. Australia is often used as a blind by the pesticide companies in saying that we don't really have any evidence of losses in Australia, but that's a complete lie. It's public relations. They've lost a lot of bees. The main point about Australia is that most of the beekeeping is wild beekeeping in the backcountry, because the honeys that they get from acacia, eucalyptus and manuka are far more valuable. So not many farmers put their bees among the arable crops. The ones who do have lost a lot of bees. But the common factor in every case is neonicotinoid insecticides. And what I tried to get across yesterday to the Sierra Club is that we have to understand we're talking about a quantum leap in toxicity. The old pesticides were a bit like the Stone Age club. You clubbed the insects to death in a crude manner. The new insecticides are like a molecular laser beam or a particle beam that kills in a molecular amount. It's completely different. So the reason why they are a quantum leap is that they are, as you know, systemic. They perfuse the sap, the leaves, the pollen, the nectar. They're neurotoxic in that they're specifically designed to attack the nervous system and the brain of the insect, but they also attack the nervous system of any animal, bird, fish that uses the same neurotransmitters, and unfortunately we all do. And this is the crucial point. These are hypertoxic. There are many, many, many orders of toxicity greater than traditional pesticides. It's estimated that imidacloprid is between 7,000 and 8,000 times more toxic than DDT. They're also soluble and migrate in water, so they move away from the field they're planted in. They persist in soil for 1 to 4 years, and the half-life of clothianidin has been estimated at 19 years on some clay soils. Now this factor alone should have got them banned immediately. They should never have been licensed in the European Union, because it is illegal to license any pesticide that has a persistence of greater than 150 days. But they went ahead and did it anyway. They are lethal to bees at 1 to 3 parts per billion. And I often explain to audiences I'm talking to, none of us ordinary folk know what a part per billion is. But it's very simple. If you put a teaspoon in a litre of water, that's a part in 1,000. If you put a teaspoon in 1,000 litres of water, which is a metric ton, that's a part in 1,000,000. And if you put 1 teaspoon in 1,000 metric tons, which is the same volume as an average sized swimming pool, that level of dilution will still kill a bee. They migrate from the crop into flowers around the edge of the fields. And as you know, the main ones we're concerned with are imidacloprid, introduced in 1992, clothianidin in 2003, thiamethoxam in 2010. And the other crucial thing that I try and explain to naive audiences is it's the prophylactic use of pesticides that has changed everything. In the past, pesticides were applied as a reaction to an invasion of insects, and they might only be applied 1 year in 4. Now every single grain of wheat, barley, oilseed rape, canola in every single field in America is treated as an insurance policy every year, year after year, and the pesticide burden is simply enormous. So the next slide is a comparison of this is one of the French slides from Dr. Bonmatin at the National Centre for Scientific Research in France. And this shows the relative toxicities of pesticides from 1945 to the present day. And you'll see at the very top of the screen it says DDT, and they gave that an index of 1. And at that time it took 27,000 parts per billion to kill to get an LD 50 kill of bees, to kill 50% of the bees within 48 hours. If you then go to the bottom of the screen, which is in red, you will see that imidacloprid has a relative toxicity of 7,300 times greater than DDT. This is beyond imagination in terms of its efficiency. It only takes 3.7 nanograms to kill a bee as opposed to 27,000 nanograms. So when the EPA says farmers are using less pesticide, that's a vast oversimplification. The pesticides they're using are infinitely more toxic, so they're actually using more pesticides. Next slide. This is from a Japanese campaign which is trying to stop neonics being used in Japan, and it points out that the nervous systems of bees and human beings are essentially the same. They use acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter. They're both affected by neonicotinoids in different ways, and we don't really know the human dimension. Hank Tennekes, who's the toxicologist in Holland, is convinced that neonicotinoids attack the synapses and have a cumulative, irreversible effect. And he's particularly worried about the implications of that for pregnant women at a time when human embryos are the same size as a bee. His logic is that the nervous system of a baby in the womb is much more likely to be damaged. Next slide. This is a simple cartoon graphic from Japan, again showing the actual way in which neonicotinoids affect synapses in the brain. In effect, what they do is they block the acetylcholine receptor, which in effect turns the nerve on all the time. So the bee is completely overloaded with sensory information to the point where it cannot navigate, it cannot fly, it cannot perform, which is why your bees don't return to the hive. They disappear in the field. So this is a red-tailed bumblebee queen in my garden on a cranesbill flower. As you know, there are 20,000 species of wild bees and pollinators. I'm not entirely sure how many America has, but I'm sure it's about 4,000? 4,000 species of wild pollinators. And of course they are all equally vulnerable to the neonicotinoids as are our managed colonies of honeybees. And again, to make the point that the mountain flora above certain tree line is excessively dependent upon wild pollinators and bumblebees, because we just don't have honeybees in those zones most of the year. Again, to make the point that this goes way beyond bees, these are rowan berries in my garden at home, and they feed blackbirds and thrushes in the winter, and in particular they feed birds called fieldfares, which migrate to the UK from Russia, Siberia, Scandinavia, and if they arrive in Britain in January in the deep snow and there are no berries, then they starve. So berries, nuts, wild fruits and all of those things are pollinated by bees and bumblebees and so on. And without them, the entire wild food chain is endangered. These slides are from Tom Theobald's Boulder County Beekeepers site, and this shows, I can't animate these, but this shows the state of play, hang on, of America in 1993, when the map is completely white and empty because there was no imidacloprid being used at that time. And the next slide shows leaps forward to 2009, and you can see that in all the Corn Belt Midwest areas and in California, there is a massive use of imidacloprid. And the next slide, I haven't shown the blank screen again, but imidacloprid was progressively replaced by clothianidin, which is even more toxic. That's the current state of play, that we currently have 240 million acres of American crops contaminated by clothianidin, which is wreaking havoc with not just the bees but the entire ecosystem. So my own experience was that from 1994 to 2001 I lived in an area near the coast in Scotland where there was no industrial monoculture. Beekeeping was my hobby. I had about 10 hives. I never had any problems. I looked at my bees every couple of weeks, and I took off the honey in the autumn and gave it and shared it with friends. And this is some of my honey at that time. And this slide is the last honey harvest I ever gathered, which was in 2006. And I got about 10 or 15 kilograms at that time. I should have got 200 kilograms, but my bees have not really made any honey since 2006 because of the impact of neonicotinoids. They either just don't thrive, the numbers never build enough, they never build up enough to get a crop, or the queens are superseded 2 and sometimes 3 times in one season. Okay, this is an explanation again for non-beekeepers. Here are 3 worker bees sucking up honey, sucking up sugar syrup during the winter feeding. And as you all know, as beekeepers, females workers only live for about 6 weeks, and there's a constant cycle of replacement within the hive. And because of that, evolution has gifted the bee a weak immune system individually. Nature never saw any point in giving an animal that only lives 6 weeks a strong immune system. But it compensated for that by giving them a very strong social immune system. So bees groom each other 24 hours a day, remove bacteria, fungal particles and so on. And one of the fundamental characteristics of neonicotinoids, which is even used in Bayer's advertising, is that it disrupts and destroys social behaviour among social insects. And this is how they advertise their anti-termite product. So if social behaviour starts to break down in a hive, that hive is doomed, because the entire hive is a superorganism that needs social behaviour all the time. So this is one of my queens with some bees. This is slide 20. And she should live for 3 years, and many old beekeepers used to be proud of the fact that queens would live for 4 years, and at the height of the season she'd be laying 1,500 eggs per day. And that means that she more or less eats her own weight in food every day, which is supplied to her by the worker bees. But of course that food that's being fed to her will include traces of pesticide. So she will be eating roughly, 1,000 times more food than an average worker bee. So if there is pesticide around, she's going to be getting a lot more than the average worker, which is why our queens are being damaged by slow, chronic, sublethal poisoning. And my failed hives generally have tried to replace their queens once or twice in a single season, which means the end of honey. There's no honey from that hive that year. This slide is a picture of a sunflower with the seeds ready to be harvested, and the point to make here is that if that sunflower has been treated with neonicotinoids, every single one of those seeds which results will be carrying neonicotinoid within it, and the flowers themselves would have poisoned the bees that visited it. This is canola growing near my home, and it's a field that I walked around for a solid hour. This was in May 2012, I think it was. And I walked around that field for an hour on a beautiful warm May morning, and I did not see a single insect. Nothing. No hoverflies, no bumblebees, no honeybees. The situation in the UK, in the USA, sorry, is that we have 240 million acres of American crops treated with neonicotinoids, mainly corn, which bees visit for the pollen, wheat and canola, which they love the pollen of the and nectar of the canola, cotton and berry and orchard fruits. So this is the environment that the corporations are creating. This is canola growing in the top of this photograph with barley growing below it, and that entire landscape has been treated with neonicotinoids, every single seed, which means that all of the canola flowers are poisonous, and the entire area has also been treated with herbicides, so there are no wildflowers during the rest of the year. So the net result of that is this is an ecological desert, and this is just near my home, so this is a very small scale. The situation in America is you have an area 10 times the area of Scotland under neonicotinoid treated crops. So we are creating an ecological desert on a truly vast scale. This is one of my hives again, showing pollen in the comb, and the point of course is that Penn State did a very famous study, Marianne Fraser did a very famous study in which she analysed the pesticides being found in stored pollen as it came into the hive, and they found 36 different agricultural pesticides in a single hive in the wax and the pollen, with an average of 4 different pesticides coming in any single pollen load. And the net result of that, it means that bees are going out into an ocean of agricultural pesticides and poisons. This is a nice picture of pollen stored in the comb, and non-beekeepers are possibly not aware that the pollen might be stored for a whole year. And the pollen which has been stored away in the Midwest is the pollen that will be consumed in spring in California when they come to do the almond pollination. So if the pollen was contaminated and stored away in May or June, it may only have its toxic effect in February or March in California. And of course, certainly in Britain, there is no testing of these pesticides for chronic or sublethal effects. In 1994, when all of this began, the French sunflowers were treated with Bayer's gaucho, which is imidacloprid based, for the first time, and 1 million colonies of bees died that year in France. There was a huge fight which ensued, in which Bayer denied that its pesticides could be responsible. The net effect was that the French did their own independent research and they banned imidacloprid in 2000, and they have never rescinded that ban. This is just a slide from the UK that shows how imidacloprid was the dominant pesticide used until about 2006, but it was progressively replaced with clothianidin since that time. And as we said before, it is systemic, present in roots, sap, stem, leaves, flowers, nectar and pollen, highly toxic and highly persistent. So this is just a little comment about an idea which I'd never heard of until recently, which is the idea of regulatory capture, the idea that an industry like the pesticide industry can actually take control of a regulatory agency like the Environmental Protection Agency. In 2003, American EPA licensed Bayer's clothianidin to be used on corn and oilseed rape. But the EPA's own scientists had advised against regulation. This is actually from their own document. Clothianidin is highly toxic to honeybees on contact. It has potential for toxic chronic exposure to bees through nectar and pollen. And the effects of this toxic exposure, chronic exposure, may include lethal and sublethal effects on the larvae and reproductive effects in the queen. And the net result of that was the EPA chose to ignore all of that and license it anyway. And the view of many people in the USA who've looked at this is that clothianidin never met the requirements for registration, and therefore arguably it was licensed illegally. It never met the conditions. On a human level, wheat, certainly in America and the UK, which used to be called the staff of life in the Bible, now contains neurotoxins. And you and I and everybody listening to this has what's called an acceptable daily intake of neurotoxins, although no one ever asked me whether I was willing to be gifted an acceptable daily intake. And the hub of this keeps coming back again: neonicotinoids, lethal to insects and birds, and we as yet do not know what the implications are for human health. Another aspect of this, outside of the agricultural one, is the question of garden plants and bulbs that we buy in the garden centre. This is a picture of a Dutch tulip, of which billions are exported to the UK and to America and other countries annually. And we know that these contain massively higher levels of neonicotinoids because Holland has the most intensive agriculture in the world, and they use vast amounts of neonics. So it's our view that almost all garden centre plants that one is likely to buy in trays, geraniums, petunias, these kind of things, are generally speaking always laced with neonicotinoids. The seeds are treated before they're planted, the compost contains neonicotinoids, and the plants are generally given a foliar spray. And then in addition, the domestic consumer is encouraged to buy sprays as they leave the garden centre with their plants to take home. So there is not much refuge for bees even in the urban situation. You can have large amounts of neonics available. I've already mentioned the fact that neonics are highly persistent in soil, and they're also mobile in groundwater. So this is a slide from Hank Tennekus in Holland. It was part of a lecture in which he gave, pointing out that going beyond bees, neonicotinoid insecticides are highly lethal to spiders, arachnids, beetles, butterflies, cicadas, dragonflies, grasshoppers, and earthworms, and so on. So we're talking about much wider effects on the ecology than just managed honeybee colonies. And this is a graph showing the massive decline of butterflies that has occurred in Holland since 1992. I don't know if such a graph exists for the United States. This is another graph showing that Diptera, which is the biological family that contains flies, massively decline when imidacloprid is present in the environment. And that has enormous implications for insectivorous birds. This slide, 36, is the cover of the American Bird Conservancy report that came out last year. And the crucial quotes from that are: a single corn kernel coated with a neonicotinoid will kill a songbird, and 1 grain of wheat treated with imidacloprid can fatally poison a bird, while as little as 1/10 of a neonicotinoid coated corn seed can affect egg laying and the survivability of chicks, which is exactly the same scenario that occurred with DDT back in the 1960s. This is an aggregate graph from my own country. This shows the 19 aggregated bird species found on UK farmland. They've declined in numbers by an average of 50% since 1975, and the decline is accelerating. Some individual species like skylarks have declined by over 80%, and the authorities just say, well, this is climate change, it's accidental, no one really knows. But we're convinced that this is to do with the lack of insect life. All of these birds require insects to feed their young, and without insects there are no young birds. So these are just some pictures of insectivorous birds. This is a robin from my own garden. I think you call these chickadees, we call them blue tits or titmice, and a blackbird. And this is a shot of a blackbird's nest. I'm making the point that DDT and neonicotinoids cause eggshell thinning, and they cause chicks to be born dead in the shell. And I'm going to speed up a little because I'm going to get into the discussion. This is Hank Tennekus's book, The Systemic Insecticides, A Disaster in the Making, which he will give copies of to anyone who's interested, but you can also buy it on Amazon for a few dollars. It's an e-book. I'll flick through these. And there was a very large study done in Europe which has tied in insecticides, the decline of bird species in general, But America hasn't quite reached the point of Europe and Holland yet. This graph shows the extinction of two species which have lived in Holland certainly for the last 10,000 years, the corn bunting and the ortolan bunting, and the decline begins absolutely on the dot in 1990 when neonicotinoids were introduced, and by 2007 those species were extinct. This has never happened before in European history. The windchat is following a similar path. It's not extinct yet. It was once a common bird. And very interestingly, this slide is of the oyster catcher, which is in fact the national bird of Holland, and that is declining so swiftly that they estimate it will be extinct by 2020. The starling has virtually disappeared from the UK. There were once millions of starlings in London. They have disappeared within 20 years. And the skylark has gone down by over 80%, for the simple reason that if there are no insects, you will have no skylarks. It's as simple as that. The grey partridge is declined by over 90% in Britain and Holland, and that's a bird that has important economic implications because it's used for hunting and it's what the farmers like to have around. The crested lark is now extinct in Holland, and it began to become extinct again in 1990, around the time neonics were introduced. The great reed warbler is heading for extinction. It's declining very fast. The northern wheatear is heading, that will be extinct by 2015, they think. And the house sparrow, which was once the commonest bird in London, cannot be found in any British city anymore. And that's all happened in 20 years. The tawny pipit is now extinct in Holland, again starting the same period. And this is my last slide. This is Dr. Rosemary Mason, who's a British retired doctor, has written a thesis, a hypothesis, in which she sets forth the argument that the same immune suppression reaction which is been proven to exist in bees, that the tiniest exposure to neonicotinoids causes the collapse of the bee's immune system, which means that they are then vulnerable to viruses, bacteria, fungal diseases, and a whole host of pathogens. Rosemary argues that she is seeing that same mechanism in the widespread deaths of amphibians and frogs and salamanders, the bats that have died in North America from white nose disease, and there's been several very large-scale bird deaths in Britain with chaffinches and greenfinches that have died from fungal infections, which we think they've picked up by eating neonicotinoids in grain. So I'm coming to the end now. That's a broad overview of how neonicotinoids are affecting the managed honeybee populations, the wild bumblebee populations, the wild pollinator populations, and how that knock-on effect is affecting the wider ecology through the collapse in the food chain caused by the absence of insects and increasingly, I think, by the absence of pollination of wildflowers, which means there will be less food in the long term going around in mountain areas and so on. So I'm grateful for your patience in listening to that, and I think we're coming to, you can all pitch in and ask questions now. Thank you for your time.
So, questions? If you were on mute, don't forget to take yourself off mute.
This is Brad, Mr. Cramline.
Yes?
I have a question, not exactly pertaining to honeybees, but do you have any soil profile information what this continual application is doing to the health of the soil and plants that grow subsequently, microbe level?
Yes, well, one of the things that we didn't get into just now is that, of course, I should have mentioned the neonicotinoids have been banned in all the 27 countries of Europe as of December 1st, 2013. One of the main reasons they were banned is that there were over 100 peer-reviewed studies considered by the European Food Safety Authority, and crucially in that there were a number of studies which showed that imidacloprid and clothianidin were building up in the soil through annual applications. And it's against the law to have any pesticide in Europe which persists for more than 150 days, and all of these studies were showing an average persistence of 1100 days. So there was an enormous political battle, and Europe was on the defensive as to why it allowed a pesticide to be made legal for sale when it was persisting in soil for nearly 10 times the permitted value. And the answer was, they said the legislation said there must be no unacceptable risk. And they then turned around and said, well, we think the risk is acceptable. But all of the evidence is that it builds up in the soil, that if the farmer doesn't plant a treated crop the next year or even the second year, there will still be enough pesticide in the soil to come up through wildflowers that will kill bees.
Okay, the question was, what is it doing, or is there any data on what it's doing to the soil profile, like at the microbe level? Is it sterilizing the soil sooner or later so the soil's going to be unproductive?
I honestly don't, I'm not technically minded enough to answer that, but I can certainly, if you send us an email, I can send you the relevant papers. I will have those papers. I'm sure there are lots of studies going on as to what it's doing to the soil. I think the overriding issue is that, of course, neonicotinoids are not just being applied alone. The same soils that are being blasted with neonicotinoids are being blasted with glyphosate and Roundup and all kinds of fungicides. So the fungal communities in the soil, the bacterial communities, the insect communities are more or less destroyed.
I have a question.
Okay.
Well, I think,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
my comment would be there, you know, if our farmers knew what was happening to their soil, they'd be very upset at the chemical companies for the spillifids in the soil. So I think we can get a lot of buy-in when our farmers become educated on what's happening to their soil, because right now, you know, we're a third party, but when they know what they're doing to their own farms, I think we'll have a lot of buy-in for change.
Okay, thanks for that comment. Susan, you were saying?
Thanks, Brett. So I guess my question is to learn more about what's going on in Europe, because we know that it's not a complete ban right now on neonics. It's just the ones that are a ban on bee attractive crops, applications of neonics to bee attractive crops. So I guess what I don't know enough about is what kinds of uses did they ban in France and Italy, right. And there's not a scientific paper out about the rebound of the hives in France and Italy that I've been able to find. There's some news articles. Yeah. So who's doing, are any researchers tracking that?
Susan's question is what's happening in Europe because of the ban which came into effect on December 1st, 2013. And that ban was actually only a suspension, and it's what's called a limited suspension. They suspended the use of imidacloprid, clothianidin and thiamethoxam on, quotes, bee attractive crops, which included maize or corn, canola or oilseed rape, and berry crops and other crops. Now, there's a huge argument going on at the moment, which is a lot of people are saying a 2-year ban for a pesticide that stays in the soil for 4 years is utterly meaningless. And the second point is they haven't banned it on crops like potatoes and other crops which bees aren't attracted to. So the political finger on the pulse is this ban is not going to stop after 2 years, because there are more and more and more scientific studies coming down the pike. The people who can really help with that, there is a marvellous woman called Noah Simon Delso who runs something called the European Beekeeping Coordination. Now the European Beekeeping Coordination is a scientific group based in, I think they have offices in Brussels, and their job is to keep tabs on everything that's happening in science and politics, and they then lobby the European Parliament and the European Food Safety Agency, and they'll be lobbying about this, so they can get you any paper. I can put you in touch with them, there's no problem.
But in terms of the scientists that are working on the issue in Italy, I know that France has a really great bee lab in Avignon.
Yes.
But I wonder about what's going on in Italy and what, I mean, are they tracking hive health and colony failures and...
I honestly don't know. I know that there's a Professor Miney at Milan who's been very prominent. But the important thing to grasp at the moment is that Bayer and Syngenta are suing the European Union. That's like suing the American government for having dared to ban the pesticides. And that's an enormous battle which I think they will lose. And I'm really pleased they're doing it because it increases the anger and resentment against them and the grassroots feeling that we must keep these banned. The big question for Americans is, why is the peer-reviewed science valid in Europe to the extent that these chemicals have been banned in 27 countries, whereas the same peer-reviewed evidence which is on the desk of the EPA has led to zero movement, zero action? And I can't answer that because I don't live here, but somebody needs to answer that.
Question.
Question.
Is there any studies happening right now regarding neonics and humans? Are there any medical studies that we could tie into?
There are some studies. The question was, are there any medical studies on the human effects of neonicotinoids? There was a study which we circulated on the neonics list 3 days ago about a significant link between autism and pregnant women's exposure to neonics. It was a statistically significant link, but the authorities have shied, in the same way they've shied away from actually doing real studies on real bees in the UK, they have kept everybody firmly away from looking at pregnant women and human health effects. But I think there will be studies going on. I can easily find out for you when I get back.
My only reason being is because I understand that the EPA will make changes based on what's going on with humans.
Well,
maybe not.
It'd be nice to think so, yes. Anybody else want to ask or make any
One more
comments?
arrow in our quiver.
Other questions?
Yes, hi, Tom.
Is that Tom?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Tom. Yeah, we can hear you.
Graham, could you relate, part of the concern on many of our parts is that this is a drama that plays itself out repeatedly, and that American beekeeping is being subjected to the same kind of manipulation and deception and delay that occurred in Europe. Can you just relate a little bit about what has taken place in Europe and how it compares to what's going on over here?
Sure. If you take the big view, the long view, going back to 1994, when the first collapse of bees happened in France, when imidacloprid was introduced, it's pretty obvious that Bayer knew in advance that was going to happen. They already had all of the public relations lined up. They denied outright that the pesticides were responsible, and then when the French proved that the pesticides were involved, they just withdrew a few yards and said, oh yes, well, and they had a progressive withdrawal strategy. And they knew that they could hold things up or delay things for maybe 5 years. So they used delaying tactics, they used disinformation, they funded bogus science studies that pointed towards cell phones and climate change and viruses and varroa. They used all of that. And then when it came down to the hard fight, they got really nasty and started to sue the actual scientists in France who had exposed the imidacloprid. So Bon Matin was hauled into court, and they said he had defamed their products, and they were going to sue him for millions of dollars, and they were going to ruin his career. And the French farmers marched on the court, and the entire French beekeeping union marched on the court, and the judge threw the case out in 15 minutes and awarded all costs to Bon Matin. What they did in Britain, they then moved on to Britain and Holland, and we don't know how they did this, we just know they did it. They managed to buy the executives of the major national beekeeping organisations. We don't know how it was done, we just know it was done. The British Beekeeping Association formed a secret company in 2000 specifically to receive around £20,000 a year from Bayer and Syngenta and Dow. This was done without the knowledge of the members, and in return they endorsed Bayer's pesticides as, quotes, bee-friendly. I must say this was not the neonicotinoids. They were talking about cypermethrin and alpha-cyhalothrin. both of which are deadly to bees. So the strategy they followed is to, first of all, tell lots of lies and spread lots of disinformation. And then when the beekeepers start to get suspicious, they say, we want you to join a big pollinator defense protection discussion community conference, which will be ongoing, and we'll have meetings every month, and we'll all get together in Washington and circulate papers, and we'll go to dinner. And the Germans in particular fell for this, and the entire German professional beekeeping organization agreed to be part of what was called the German Bee Monitoring Study, and Bayer put several £1 million into it, or millions of dollars. And after 3 years, Walter Hafeker, who's the president, said, we suddenly realized we'd been sat in a room shaking hands and having dinner with these people and giving them data and information, and nothing whatsoever had changed. And we realized that the entire objective of this so-called engagement was a delaying tactic to tie us up in a labyrinth of papers and a maze of words and meetings, and of course once you get to know people and you have dinner with them, it's really hard to turn around the next day and call them bastards, you know. And the Germans, to their credit, said, well, we are going to call you people bastards, we're not going to cooperate with you anymore, your objective is to keep on poisoning our bees, and we are going to stop you. And from that point onward, all of their effort went into getting the European Union to ban Bayer's products. And that's the status quo. But the Germans and the French both won the battle. The British lost it. The entire British beekeeping establishment is firmly tucked up in bed with Bayer. I would never be asked to give this kind of talk in Britain. I would never be allowed to attend any meeting of the British Beekeepers Association. I've been banned from the forum. I've been banned from the Scottish Beekeepers Forum. The Scottish beekeepers and the British beekeepers both voted against the European ban last December, and they both, if you hear any of them speak at any time, they sound like Dennis van Engelsdorp. It's multifactorial, 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 varroa, varroa, varroa. It's viruses, vampire flies and mites. And, you know, it's up to you guys to decide where on that spectrum you lie. I can't speak for you, but that is the strategy. The strategy is to deny everything, to appear to be very human and wonderful and warm, and we want to engage. And they even have their own delegates going around the country saying this, and you know who those people are. They go on paid tours, and they tell everyone it's the Varroa. Anyway, I hope, you know, the thing that America needs to do is to not fall for what the Europeans fell for. To realise that you are being taken for a ride, and you're not going to get anywhere till you start fighting them. It's simple. Anybody else?
I have another question.
Okay.
In the EU, is the industry promising even worse pesticides if this is completely suspended? Because that's what beekeepers here are talking about, is what is coming up the pike.
Yes.
If this is banned, how bad can the next one be?
Well, I think all the people who are listening to us, they know what's coming next, which is sulfoxaflor, which is another neonicotinoid-like pesticide. I said to someone the other day that everything we've experienced in the last 20 years, all the bee deaths we've experienced, all of the pesticides, the 3 neonicotinoids that are mainly used, that's just the bow wave of a super tanker that stretches in that direction for several hundred meters. And they have got product after product after product lined up, and the playbook will be exactly the same as they have used so far. They will get it through the licensing by conditional registration, by telling lies. Once it's registered, they will lie and lie and lie as the bees start to die. And then when it's obvious that it's killing them, they will use the delay retreat, the slow retreat, delaying tactics, engage people in pollinator defense councils, bee discussion groups, bee programs, national initiatives, the Bayer Bee Care program, and so on. All of these are designed to tie us up and slow us down and stop us taking action. So I'm absolutely certain there are probably a dozen products coming down the pike. It's very depressing. And I don't make my living from bees. Some of the people listening to this have lost thousands of beehives and have paid out hundreds of thousands of dollars I don't know how people can live with that. I don't understand it.
May I ask one more question?
Sure.
What actions do you propose?
Could I say something about this? They're going to use worse pesticides if we relieve them of the neonicotinoids, because I came through that era where we had those worse pesticides, and I was one of the creators of one of the first cooperative spray alert programs in the country, and we had close communications with the applicators here in our area, and closed the bees in, usually screened them in, avoided the first day's damage. Furigan was the biggest problem, but still we took horrible bee kills from those applications in May. We might have an apron of bees extending 18 inches out from the front of the hive and 2 inches deep. But the difference was the bees could recover from that setback and produce a commendable crop of honey. And we had two things then that we don't have now. We had an essentially healthy population of bees and an essentially healthy environment. And we have neither of those now.
Someone said to me, and I think this is true, if I got a beginner beekeeper in the UK today, he would be someone who's never seen a hive of healthy bees. And in fact, I've been sort of gone down the path of beginning to accept that what I regard as the bees I've got now, I regard as normal because I've had it for 7 or 8 years. And in fact, if an old beekeeper who'd never seen this came and saw my hives, he'd be horrified. He'd say, that's not normal. Those hives should be twice as big. They should be bursting with bees at this time of year. But by very slow process of erosion, you become habituated to thinking that these weak hives producing 10 pounds of honey a year is normal. And of course it's not. So that reinforces your point.
Back to your question, Terry.
What actions can we do?
I don't know I think the actions that the American beekeeping community has to do is that on a strategic level, I would be very happy if they looked at what had happened in France and looked at what had happened in Germany and recognized the pattern, and instead of going through the same painful process of being slowly disenchanted, actually leapfrogged that position and said, well, we'll leap ahead and start to do what the Germans did, but not wait 4 years to do it. Because all of the evidence is that you are being lured into an abusive relationship in which the people you're dealing with are not honest. They have a completely ruthless attitude, which is to keep these products on the market. And they're terrified of what's happened in Europe, and they're terrified that you will start to go down the same path. Because the logic of what happened in Europe, to any scientist, is that logic must be applied here. If chemicals are banned in 27 countries in Europe because of the science, then the same science should apply here. And the big question is, why is the EPA not doing it? So at the the organizational level, the organizations have to be lobbying the EPA and the Congress, and I know that's going on, and I think there's great hope in the Center for Food Safety's lawsuit which they're bringing against the EPA. But I think the other thing that is missing at the moment is there needs to be a mass public awareness raising. We need a collecting box on the counter of every supermarket saying, help us save the bees, give us $10. And I don't know who that organization should be that does that, whether it's the Pollinator Defense Council or the Stewardship Council, or whether it's the Beyond Pesticides, or whether it's the Sierra Club. I tried to persuade the Sierra Club yesterday that they should be helping to do that. And they weren't saying they wouldn't do that, they just said that wouldn't be normal for them to do that. But I don't think the scientists are ever going to solve this. I don't think the regulators are ever going to solve this. I think what will solve this is when 100 million Americans stand up and shout, this is not acceptable. And I don't know how you do that, but that's going to have to be done.
Other comments or questions?
Jeff here. I'd like, Graham, are you familiar with some of the trade agreements, international trade agreements that are in progress right now? And
Yes.
If you are, could you comment on a little bit?
Yeah, there's something very, very scary. I'm not an expert on this, and it's all been kept under wraps and little bits filter out to the public, but there are two very, very important things that have been negotiated by the Obama administration. One's called the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement, and the other one's called the Trans-Pacific Free Trade Agreement. And what that essentially it's under the auspices of the World Trade Organization, which is a supranational body which you and I have no control over. We don't elect people to it, we can't control it in any way. And what those agreements say is, if clothianidin is legal in the United States and approved by a legal agency like the EPA, it is automatically legal in Europe. And the implication is, if Europe refused to take clothianidin from the United States, the WTO would sue them for £20 billion profit forgone. So what that in effect means is, it means the disenfranchisement of the UK Parliament, the German Bundestag, the French National Assembly. It means all of those legislators cease to exist. It means the European Food Safety Agency ceases to exist, and the only arbiter as to what is legal, what is toxic, what is acceptable becomes a bunch of anonymous bankers called the World Trade Organization and the American corporations. And this has been passed. I mean, this is going through right now. I think it will be fought tooth and nail. I think people, particularly in Germany and France, will literally take to the streets. But it literally means that, just to take an example, you know, you have this awful hormone treatment for cows in this country, bovine gonadotrophin, that increases milk yield by double but kills the cows. And that's never been allowed in Europe, that's banned. Well, under this, they would have to take that. They would have no choice. We would have no choice to reject GM corn. There's no GM corn allowed in Europe as yet. We would have no choice, and neither would the Japanese or the Chinese or whatever. So they're going for global. This is all a plan. None of this is accidental. They are going to impose this technology on every single country in the world. They will go to India and say, you either take this or we will financially break you. You know, it's very, very sinister. We've never known anything like it in our lifetimes. And bees are very, very, very way down the pecking order in terms of what is sacrificable in order to get global domination. That's my feeling anyway.
Questions? Other questions? Well, I think Graham has left us with some marching orders. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm sure you're going to be in the country until the 22nd, is that correct? I'm
going to be in the Bay Area till the 22nd, but I'm tied up with the John Muir conference from the 18th to 22nd. But if anybody else wants me to do anything, I'll try and do it. I'm very, very grateful to the Pesticide Research Institute for putting this together. It's a really nice thing to have done. I don't know why we didn't do it 2 years ago, I mean, from my side of the pond. And thank you all I know you all know far more about bees than I do, and this is singing to the choir, and the choir already knows the hymn. But I hope that you can use the PDF I sent out in some form, and that it will do something in raising awareness. And thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Graham.